perhaps narrowed into a notion of happiness, and that narrow notion of happiness is seen as a kind of either as a state or a state of fulfilled desires or a state of pleasure. Both these are too narrow for our purposes. We don't develop a complete description of what well-being in our scheme is, but we are going to connect it to our larger purpose through the notion of embodied cognition. As I mentioned, what is the nature of flourishing? That is interesting. And the moment we say that flourishing or well-being is a valued end, what kind of an end is that? And what active role does it have in human cognition or human actions? Now, expanding on that brings us up against some notorious difficulties that it has been extremely difficult to measure, compare, and define well-being. Where such attempts have been made in economics, for instance, what obtains is a highly objective measure of well-being. Objective in the sense, something that can be measured independent of subjective preferences and subjective states of mind, measured by an uninterested party, an economist, if you will, who can measure, categorize, and rank certain kind of capacities or preferences in a kind of order which tells you something about people's well-being and which allows the economist to compare them. So interpersonal comparison has been a very important aspect, and we would like to move away from that because we feel that fundamentally this is unhelpful, particularly in relation to education. And any notion of well-being that is significant for education has to have ambitions far beyond that. So we claim that education is in the category of human activities that are extremely significant from the point of view of flourishing. Now, to some, the fact that this might require justification may come as a surprise. For some who are tired of the difficulty of objectively defining flourishing and well-being, this might be a distraction. So, that education has instrumental significance, it's well accepted. In fact, in the popular imagination, much of the discourse of education is about what it allows human beings to do and achieve and accomplish, whether it is in terms of income, employment, status, etc., or accomplishing other goals. So we argue that the value of education, most importantly, is in its contribution to a good life. Now, it's not, again, our purpose to define or explain what a good life might be, and it is possible that we have to allow for the greatest diversity in the capacity of individuals and communities to define what good life might be. However, education in whatever context is significant for people's flourishing and to their ability to achieve what they might and what to some extent others might call is a good life. So the structure of this presentation is that I will stop at this point and ask Rajesh to continue, because our first intent is to make the case that where we are, our point of departure is the argument that well-being and flourishing are extremely significant for education, and go on to talk about well-being and cognition in a manner which can make sense of that particular claim and relate it back to education a little later.
Thanks for letting us speak here. My goal here, I mean, I'm a cognitive scientist. I don't know much about the philosophy of education, but my goal here is to at least introduce embodied cognition, and Aristotle was mentioned in one of the comments earlier, as sort of the substantial cause of well-being, so in a technical sense. So you could say that well-being is a cloth that is woven out of the fabric of embodied cognition, right? But a much better way of putting it, and forgive me if you don't understand Hindi, there's a famous Gulzar song, right? Dil dhoondta hai, fir wahi fursat ke raat din, बैठे रहें और आंगन में लेट कर, right? So if you remember, that is well-being. That's very bodily well-being. The ability to just, on a winter's day, lying outside on a cot in the sun. To me, that is well-being. I'm not sure how it's related to education, but I'm sure Venu will find out some connection, right? So what we are trying to say here is that the capability approach, which Amartya Sen and others pioneered, which of course has Aristotelian roots, is very well suited as a partner to embodiment in this integration of cognitive and ethical doctrines, so to speak, right? And the idea is that the body, and again, forgive me if I use sort of a mathematical terminology, but the body is a kind of prior. It sort of offers the container which limits the freedoms that you are capable of achieving even in principle, right? So for example, as bipedal creatures, we can't really expect to fly. And so at least any reasonable account of capabilities cannot have flying as one of the functionings that needs to be achieved. Though, of course, we have sort of made up for that lack by inventing aeroplanes and things. And the limitation of our approach, at least right now, is the difficulty of really measuring and formalizing what subjective well-being is, right? And we don't really have that conception that integrates objective and first-person subjective approaches. The particular angle that I'm going to take was pioneered by the, again, sort of biologist, mathematician, cognitive scientist Francisco Varela, who talks about something called neurophenomenology, where you try to bring first, second, and third person approaches into some kind of integration, but it's still very early days in those really fluid, person-independent ways of understanding well-being. But two key arguments. The first one is that well-being is more than access to material goods or capabilities. It's also not just transient states like happiness. So to think of the Brave New World and or Matrix, depending on how old you are, you might have a better reference frame in one or the other. But in the Brave New World, everybody's happy, but you could argue that nobody flourishes. The savage, or the person called savage, is unhappy, but is probably the most flourishing individual in that story, right? And so happiness, at least in terms of pleasure or hedonic states, is not a good, I think, measure of well-being. And material conditions and subjective states mutually influence each other in nonlinear ways, right? And so, again, the neurophenomenological approach suggests that phenomenology, neural and social correlates, and moral theory all have something to say. We don't know exactly what that is, but we are trying to explore that cluster of phenomena there. And the particular way in which we are doing it is by introducing embodied cognition. So the fact that we are cognitive creatures with flesh and blood, and that fleshiness of our minds is what constrains our capacities for flourishing, right? And in particular, the examples I'm going to use are from studies of language and concepts and higher order thought. So what is embodied cognition? A simple idea that might illustrate it is if I say the head of state, right? I mean, you're using the body as a metaphor for trying to understand something which is not an embodied entity at all, the state. I can also say head of a company, head of a family. In all of these, the head of X construction plays the role of bodily mapping of an abstract entity. And cognitive scientists of the embodied cognition variety claim that that embodied mapping is what makes us capable of thinking the kind of thoughts that we do. Right? And so that's, in particular, that's what's called conceptual metaphor. And conceptual metaphors are very robust. To give you an example, I might say that there was a 17% increase in crime in Bangalore this year, or I might say there's a crime wave in Bangalore this year. The latter statement has a metaphorical description, right? Crime wave. It's the use of a physical entity like a wave to depict how crime is increasing. It turns out that people actually use metaphors much more than we consciously are aware of. And in fact, you may self-report that you're using the 17% statistic, but chances are you are actually thinking using those metaphors, right? And so this sort of metaphorical, fleshy way of generalizing from the body to abstract affairs, and you can see why moral reasoning would be that kind of abstract affair that the body helps us reason about, is what we think is the intermediate entity, right? That mediates the individual, the interpersonal, and the institutional. So what embodied cognition in our approach tells us is this, that there is a continuous thread that links the individual, the interpersonal, and the subpersonal, okay? So to give you a famous example, John Rawls's veil of ignorance, right? And John Rawls is not an embodied cognition person. He's a formal theorist of justice, and he tries to come up with the first principles that any just society must adhere to. But interestingly enough, he uses the very evocative and metaphorical phrase, the veil of ignorance, to describe what constitutes the initial conditions of that kind of society, right? And so what we believe is that even in this most formal of affairs, where you are axiomatically trying to derive what constitutes justice, we actually use the veil of ignorance as a metaphorical bridge between sensory capacities and epistemic and other moral reasonings. Incidentally, the veil of ignorance and the use of the eyes as a trope for knowledge is not, it's across languages, and it's within English and other languages, it's endemic. So for example, you can say, I saw the truth, I was blind to the truth, or I can say things like, the truth was hidden from me. In all of these situations, so it invariably turns out that when we talk about epistemic states, we use the language of vision. And when we talk about emotional states, we use the language of touch. So I can say he was close to me, right? So there is a systematicity to the way that the body is mapped onto knowledge. Okay, and so the idea of the justice of justice as scales, and that the scale, is one of the central tropes of moral reasoning, and we think that that actually comes from the way our bodies are built. So this is going to be my last slide. What we're saying is that we need this integrative method, which starts with first-person reports. So something as simple as whether you believe an act was just or unjust. Now, human beings, as it turns out, are very bad at theorizing their own first-person states, right? So you want, if at all that's possible, access to their first-person experience without that overlay of theory, I'm sure there are many people in this room who would argue that that can't be done, but let's say that we can make a first order approximation of that. Then you look for the social as well as the psychological and neural correlates. And I just came back from a conference where people were looking at the brain basis of emotion and of compassion, right? So it's no longer surprising to look for those kinds of things. At the same time, you look for the social correlates, meaning going from the subpersonal to the suprapersonal, you look for how the kinds of embodied states that are expressed in language and in cognition are manifest themselves in macro structures, especially to take a very physical instantiation, how is the architecture of, say, Parliament House determined by the kind of moral principles that guide its founding and vice versa, right? What does being in that kind of architecture actually do to the kind of reasoning that happens within its confines? Okay, and once we integrate these two, we have a potential for a theory of flourishing, which is what we are calling eudaimonic theory.
So what we are arguing is that there is a continuity from first-person experience and understanding through interpersonal relationships to social structures, institutions, and interaction. And this continuity, all these different dimensions or levels of experience are important for understanding flourishing. The related question is, in what way do these processes influence or underpin what we call our capacity for reasoning? It depends on what we mean by reasoning and what we mean by rationality. If you move away from the notion of reason as some kind of a faculty or a capacity which can be identified with necessary and sufficient conditions, and take reasoning as a much broader process of occupying the logical space of reasons, as it were, and which allows much broader sources of reasons than certain narrowly conceived, what I would think narrowly conceived, process of objective reasoning of a certain kind, then what these sources of reasons include our experiences, biological capacities, emotions, and social capabilities. Now, if this is how complex reasoning is, how do we arbitrate and mediate this process of reasoning and the development of these capacities for reasoning through an educational process? Articulating that is a challenge that we would like to explore. So these capabilities are related to a larger framework of universe of cognition or a meaning systems that are available to any particular society. And these are not independent of embodied processes, not independent of individual capacities. They also, through embodied processes, relate to social processes. So for instance, an immediate example that comes to mind is the violence and controversy over cartoons. How do the sense or significance of a cartoon and the meaning that it seems to distill, how does that translate into riots in the streets? Right? A riot in the street is definitely a kind of a process that has very, very concrete physical consequences and manifestations in its violence, in the stones being thrown, the police, and what is how does the meaning of a cartoon translate into riots in the streets, or the sense of social reaction that something like a cartoon evokes? A cartoon is obviously the product of at one level of an individual's cognition, what the person draws, and then what is made available in the public space, and that translates into emotions in individuals, emotions in the social space, and then it translates into political action. It's reasonable, the hypothesis is that these are connected. In what way are they connected? We do not have a complete theory at the moment. I don't mean us, but in general a complete theory is not available which links these particular or complex levels of manifestation. And we also do not have a way of transcending the traditional dichotomies of the objective and the subjective, the mind and the body, the personal and the collective. But the hypothesis is that these are connected. So unless we can understand how these kind of acts of cognition translate into social meanings and social action, we will not be able to understand how education can enter the space of well-being and flourishing in the fullest extent. Right? What is the meaning that two different communities of students bring into the classroom? The question that Hardy asked in the last talk. And how do the limitations of the universe of cognition available in society, how to see social facts and how to experience social facts and the emotions arising from those social facts, how to mediate that in an educative situation, though these questions need us to integrate, right? Integrate the personal and the collective, the affective and the cognitive. And unless the social capability, a kind of a collective capacity that exists through a certain set of collective meanings available to a community at a given point in time, unless these are articulated and interrogated, we will not have a full enough rendering of what flourishing is. Now, there are challenges, serious challenges. If there weren't these challenges, the problem would have been solved long back. The first point is that subjective evaluations of well-being are notoriously fickle. The same material circumstances can give rise to entirely different evaluations of subjective well-being. Therefore, social scientists and psychologists tire of rendering in a kind of a communicable, objective way of talking about well-being. Secondly, if well-being and flourishing are important, and they seem to be, why is it that societies find it extremely difficult to provide a basic framework of material and social guarantees to all its members, which can lead to a certain basic level of material capacities and opportunities for all individuals. Now, so in that sense, if well-being, which is as a normative framework, was so self-evidently important for human beings, why is it that we systematically, not accidentally or occasionally, but systematically seem to fail to provide that basic guarantee? Having raised those challenges, we propose that it is extremely important that education has to address this question. In spite of the several gaps in our understanding, unless education promotes and supports the capacities and dispositions that enhance the possibility of flourishing, it would be fundamentally failing in its promise and purpose. There are many ideas about how education can do this. Expanding the notion of cognition and reasoning to include other processes such as emotions, feelings, embodied cognitive processes, interpersonal relationships which include these kind of understandings. these are important dimensions. Now that requires us to move away from an understanding of education or the aim of education as bringing about a particularly narrow cognitive conception of what it means to be educated and what it means to know is. So this is not to deride or dismiss the importance of a certain kind of impersonal, impartial understanding or cognitive conception of knowledge. The claim is that such a knowledge is while it provides important reasons and basis for cognition, that is incomplete. For instance, affective processes in individuals and affective processes in social relationships and interpersonal relationships produce and provide a certain kind of cognition. Now, can we articulate this with certain kind of precision, certain kind of linguistic and conceptual precision? We don't know yet. It is extremely difficult. In fact, it is the difficulty in our ability to articulate this that given emotions and feelings a bad name, right? And that these are distractions, that these are somehow contaminations of objective cognitive processes. Now, sufficient evidence exists now to say that reasoning is fundamentally, as much as it is cognitive in the narrow sense, it is an affective process. Emotions produce reasons, feelings produce reasons, and those reasons are just as important, right? Now, it is not clear, or on the contrary, it is not the role of education merely to do away with the kind of reasons emotions provide. For instance, in the kind of conflict over the cartoon, for instance, but to produce, or it is our duty or our task as educators to produce a kind of way of understanding how affective and interpersonal situations or social interaction produce certain understandings and meanings, and how a kind of a robust way of engaging with these can be appropriate for a kind of democratic society, can be understood in the educational context. And that is not a matter, in my opinion, of enhancing the power of reason narrowly construed. Many so-called Eastern philosophies of mind and knowledge have fairly rich traditions of subjective inquiry, of trying to understand, trying to explore experience in the first-person dimension. Now, one suggestion is that such first-person exploration of experience may have significant role in understanding and education of what we are talking about. One way that has been that particular proposal has been extended is to talk of reflective awareness, that in the process of relationship. The second is the idea of compassion, or its more modern version, care, as an important element of relationships. Now, the suggestion is that compassion is not merely a kind of an extraneous value grafted onto reasoning. Compassion, in a way, can constitute reasoning significantly, just as objective understanding of certain facts and states of affairs can. Now, entering the space of dialogue, of interpersonal relationship, with both a certain capacity for reasoning and reflective awareness and compassion and care may be a better model for a model of education that can underpin flourishing. I'll stop at this point and we can take questions.
Venu, we're now open for questions from the floor. Gentlemen,
as we know, you have very rightly said that our body is always already inscribed into some kind of power relationship, which is coming from, because we always are, as you have said, some universe of cognition and also bodily movement, and that also affect our presentation of self in social settings and interactions. But I was actually just wanted to know that what is the remedy of our body maybe docile and inscribing many kind of power relationship or even aggressive minds, violence. How to transform body through language? Just now actually in last paper there was a suggestion of theatre. So I think dance and theatre perhaps maybe. So I was also wondering if the theatre of Habib Tandoor or Ratanthiyam, which was actually very consciously worked on the how body can be transformed or we can achieve a different kind of. So is it in your mind? And another question is that in the options, I am actually confused, but I think that Buddhist notions, we have to perhaps rework those notions, because Buddhist notion was not able to challenge the what we can say, this Brahmanical and feudal that reaction which came after Buddhism. So should and I am also very doubtful of what is the possibilities available in Indian philosophies, but also there are some possibilities maybe in this some kind of phenomenological traditions of Paleo-Ponti, etc. So it can be, but congratulate you for this is a very good open kind of thing. Thank you.
First part of what you said as a question about whether there are educational practices available that bring in kind of an integrated conception of our experience. Yes and no. I think to a large extent it's a matter of actually exploring with the students and with the learner, the teachers and the learners in a kind of a conducive school environment, what it means to bring a much more enriched and enriching notion of awareness and experience. Now, thing is, we do not have a language to speak about it in a non-dualistic manner. It's extremely difficult to talk about this issue without talking about the mind and the body separately. So that we don't have a unified language, which is a challenge. The second part, do you want to respond? The question about whether there are connections between Buddhism, phenomenology, there are and there are not, right? And I think we have to be careful. There is a danger that this is also a kind of minefield of fads. So it's important not to, while we can walk the plank, we should not imagine that we can kind of pull ourselves up by the shoelaces and just levitate into all kinds of ideas. So therefore, as an educator, I would be very cautious, right, and not make claims about what education can achieve without actually exploring many of these issues.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you are actually giving too much responsibility to education. I mean, if you are actually, education could possibly be one of the processes that contribute to overall well-being, but if you give the sole responsibility of well-being in the terms of material and interpersonal and personal relationships, satisfying personal relationships and so on, and satisfying effective life, then it's perhaps too much to expect of education. One comment was that. One was that in one slide you seem to be saying that we really don't have a language to connect subjective and collective and so on. There was much more to that, but it just seemed to me that culture probably provides what we call as culture, even though it's very hard to define that. And third was, well, I've forgotten the third. Thank you.
We didn't say that education has the sole responsibility. Flourishing is a flourishing over a complete life, and education, at least formal education, is a part of that. So what we said is that education is is inextricably linked to the process of discovering a way of life that can be called a flourish, a good life, right? But there are so many other different areas of relationships and interaction apart from what happens in an formally educational setting. So, but however, what we meant is that if flourishing were a fundamental value and it is linked to education, education cannot escape actively engaging with that notion.
Just a little bit about the culture and language issue. It depends on what your aims are, because you could argue that at least in the social sphere, there's a very famous essay by Milan Kundera where he says that the novel is the right medium in which to explore these kinds of issues. But that doesn't really take us into the kinds of neuroscience and more technical areas of the cognitive sciences that are emerging now. So it depends on whether you want your language to be a technical language that then covers things that are not obviously in the cultural world.
There was a contribution of this.
I'm sorry, I joined you a couple of minutes late, and when I joined in, you were talking about good life. So I want that what do you mean by good life, and what the individual wants may differ from what the society wants. And is it possible by education to bring both of them, what the individual wants and what the society wants, to bring them so close that we can have a good life? Individual in somewhere in the psyche they do have a need for social acceptance. So how do you understand good life?
Me to try to provide a response. The thing is, there is a diversity of things people seem to value, right? And a good, what you could call a good life is constructed or formed out of living in a community, in a social setting as persons deeply related. Now, for individuals to discover in a way that they can themselves identify and living a good life is, we need certain kind of capacities, right? Now, education claims or education wishes to support and nurture some of those capacities, and those capacities have to be understood in a much wider context than certain kinds of narrowly rational capacities.
Also, I think this idea that individual notions of the good life and collective notions come into conflict, I think that's a false opposition. Meaning that it's not, I don't think there is a necessary reason that they have to be coherent. I mean, it's possible for different people to have different ideas of the good life and they not be brought completely into agreement with each other.
Quite a thought-provoking, profound presentation. Just missed some of the problematizations which I seek clarification for. We had two conceptions of education, education for democracy and then education for conscientization. And now we have the education for well-being. But with this notion, the way well-being and flourishing, these two words were used with only an oblique separating them. Are the authors aware that it has been written with a liberal standpoint? And when I say liberal, it stands for socio-political economic standpoint. Next was that if we are talking about education and well-being, or it is the institutionalized process of schooling through which author wished to achieve well-being, because that's what the desirable action is. And the third clarification was about the embodied cognition, that how to discriminate, and you people discriminate it with naturalism, because getting through the embodied cognition could be one of the Rousseauian idea, or if we are getting into the same understanding by the mode of dialogue, then of course Buber has talked about that idea, that how to evolve that intersubjectivity, whether it's with an object, with the society, or with the interpersonal relationship. And the last one was from the last comment. G. Moore said that we cannot define good simply because it's indefinable, because it's such a simple concept. So I don't know if there can be indefinable life if we put the principle of tautology for that matter. Thank you.
We acknowledge that much of the discourse of well-being has been in the, for instance, was reduced to the notion of happiness in the utilitarian tradition, in economics, and in the, we alluded to that. Well-being, flourishing as a liberal goal. See, in a way, we have attempted to expand the notion without trying to invent new terminology. Try to expand the meanings that you give to flourishing and well-being. That's what we have done. Whether and I think it can be done. The second question was about education. I don't. Yeah, whether we are equating educational responses to well-being in terms of only schooling. Not necessarily, right? Schooling itself is not a monolithic institutional structure, right? There are many different kinds of schools and an extremely wide range of schools, and schooling can also be seen in a very fairly wide way. However, it's also true that by and large formal education happens in an institutional context, and that's the reality. Not necessarily so, but largely so, right? The question about embodied cognition?
So embodied cognition, I guess, is a form of naturalism, but there are other naturalistic accounts that are not embodied. So for example, a very non-embodied idea of cognition is that it's only in the brain, and in which case the body doesn't play any role at all, and that's absolutely as naturalistic as an embodied approach would be. But I do think that one of the things that we're playing with is, I mean, apart from the formal schooling or not, but the relationship between institutions and individuals, and I think that that interplay will be quite important for our exploration.
So what I'm going to suggest is, first, you make them as brief as you can, and secondly, if you don't mind, speakers, we'll take them as an amalgam. So there was a gentleman in a pale shirt over there, first of all.
Well, what I gathered from your presentation is that you're trying to integrate all aspects of human activities and connecting it to education. Okay, one is there is this first person experience, okay, and then there is this third person account of what the first person is experiencing, and then there is social reality is there, and then you are also talking about the embodied cognition, okay, and then you are talking about the processing or interpreting and using languages to find out the meanings. All these has to be integrated. That is what your ambitious project is. Well, project is very good, but how you are going to do it, I feel a number of difficulties. It makes sense to me that suppose if you look at this Delhi incident, for example, I look at the TV. So I have a subjective experience of symbols, the pictures and the narrations, and I interpret them, and as interpret them to meaningful, then I respond to them. Say I go to, say, the India Gate to respond to that. So all these things are a person is doing, so there is some kind of integration is going on there. But how to integrate all those things in together. If you talk about embodied cognition, neurophysiological conditions, that is a different level of explanation. When you talk about language, interpretation, in philosophy we talk about intentional start. We look at whatever is presented to our, then you make a intentional start. That means you are interpreting in it, and that is a different level of language processing. So then you are talking about moral reasoning also. Then I feel lost.
Gentleman immediately behind there, the row behind.
My research is also in theories of human learning, and what I find difficult is while trying to overcome Bayesian dualism, sometimes we reify the division. So is it possible to reappropriate thinking, reasoning and rationality, which has been strongly associated with mind, to an embodied version, and look at the person asking the question about how the body reacts when it is being forced to be in that protest kind of thing, and where mind is actually sometimes forcing the body to act, and it doesn't seem to be a very embodied way of action in some. So is there a negotiation between activism and aesthetics that we can look through this?
Thank you. Gentleman there with the...
No, I am also lost in, first of all, you said it is subjective, therefore it's very difficult to capture. Even in subjectivity also, the notion of flourishing or wellness or goodness, happiness or whatever that you call, can vary from time to time. For example, I'm happy when I am satiated with good food. And I am also happy when I consciously go without food because because of various reasons, or dieting or something like that. Then also I feel happy about that. So that means this happiness or flourishing, etc., is varying in terms of various time and points and stages or purposes of individual experiences. That is one thing. And second thing is your arrow mark is confusing to me. Starting your arrow mark goes from first person, this one, to correlates, and this one. Whether you are explaining the first person correlates or it leads to those things. That a very confusing idea for me. Thank you.
Thank you. I've just got time for two more, and at this point in the proceedings, brevity has almost become the supreme virtue. So could I ask the gentleman down here in the blue striped shirt is...
The role of meditation in enhancing cognitive skill or mental being. Have you done any work on that, and your comments on that?
Thank you. And then Richard Pring.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Them as fully and as briefly as you can. That's two contradictory requirements.
I'll start with the last question. Let's say that some amount of misery is not necessarily outside of a flourishing life. Moving to the question of trying to integrate too many things, education is a highly integrative endeavor. Right? We do not have as educators the luxury of attending to learning in a piecemeal fashion. It has been attempted, and more attempted, more fragmentary and isolating it becomes. So the question really, see, the primary thrust of this particular presentation in today's talk is about education and relating it to flourishing. So as educators, it is incumbent on it to look at the notion of flourishing in relation to education with a highly integrative process. We don't have the luxury of cutting it down to manageable little pieces and addressing them one by one.
again, the last question first. I just saw the movie Lincoln, and I think Lincoln was both miserable and flourishing at the same time. So I think it's possible, right? So that's a very brief answer. Apart from so I want to use the media example and that sort of tragic incident in Delhi to tell you how this method can actually be made concrete and therefore lead to insights. You can't look at the media in this sort of, we're not saying that phenomenology is some undifferentiated mass. So for example, if you look at the way news media functions, and we have a good friend who is analyzing that cognitively, you can see that embodied cognition gives you a lens into how media shapes action. So for example, the newscaster is always in the center. The actors, especially the ones who you don't like, are shot from below. The people who you want the audience to like are shot in a certain kind of light. Each of these are tied to sensorial mechanisms that we all share as perceptual beings. So in that sense, actually casting that cognitive, embodied cognitive lens on something as complex as the media portrayal of an event like this gives us insights. Of course, it's not a complete story, but I think it gives us some very interesting insights.
Thank you very much indeed. We will have to wrap up at this point as we do have a further session this evening. I'd like to thank the speakers and contributors from the floor.